Okay, welcome everyone. I think we'll start the conference. So I'd like to thank you for coming to this amazing place in Campus Biotech in Geneva. So thank you for joining us. This event is organized by EPFL Alumni and brings together the EPFL, IMD, and INSEAD community, so alumni community. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mina Draganova, the president of the INSEAD Alumni Association, as well as Bertrand Muller for AMD, for this collaboration, and I hope we'll have many other events where we bring technology and business together. And many of you, by the way, are maybe alumni from many of these schools. So you are actually some of the lucky few, of the 200 lucky few. This event has been sold out very quickly after 10 days, so we were surprised. And we've had to turn down quite a few requests. So this clearly shows actually the interest in the blockchain subject. And some of you are already experts in the field. Others are keen to increase their knowledge because they can see that blockchain will have a big impact on their daily lives and on, of course, on their business. So EPFL is the, actually, as a leading institution, has actually very strong capabilities in blockchain. And more broadly, in digital trust, which has become a must in today's digital world. In December last year, we've announced the creation of the C4DT, the Center for Digital Trust, which is a platform that brings together academia, industry, governments, and civil society. And the objective is really to work together on different verticals and sectors to address the digital trust issues and find solutions for the future. So using a multidisciplinary approach, as you can see, many professors, about 33 professors are involved in this initiatives, and in different subjects, from machine learning to IoT, cloud computing, cryptography, as you can see. So many of these different subjects and expertise are needed to find solutions. And tonight we have the chance to have Professor Bryan Ford with us as a speaker, and he's definitely an expert in blockchain. So also part of the success of this initiative is also bringing different partners together to bring the subject matter expertise. And so some of these partners are already here, and you may be working in one of these companies. And if you want more information on this initiative, Olivier Crochat, who is the executive director, is here tonight, so you will be able to ask him questions. So, what is blockchain and what impact will it have on our world? So this will be actually the theme of our event. We've brought together a high-level panel, which will of experts, as you can see, from the state administration, from academia, from the humanitarian sector, from IBM, but looking at the industry, what impact it will have on the industry, and also from fintech. And so they will be sharing with you some insights on how they approach blockchain and what it means in their sector, real-world examples. And so we've also asked actually an expert to come and help us with the overall, to drive the overall discussion around blockchain. And this is, I have the pleasure to introduce Ben Robinson, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at Temenos. Ben is highly involved in blockchain subjects in many ways, and some of the ones involved in the fintech community know about him, of course. At Temenos, he leads the Marketplace, which is a platform created to facilitate exchange of value between banks and fintech companies. He also runs the Swiss Technology Group, a networking group aimed at promoting the technology industry in Switzerland. Ben is also a mentor at FinTech Fusion, which is Switzerland's first fintech startup accelerator, and he sits at the committee of the Capital Markets and Technology Association, which is an independent body looking to create common standards around security tokenization. So thank you for welcoming Ben. and enjoy the conference.
Hi everybody, good evening. So I'd just like to start by expressing my thanks for being invited to moderate this evening's discussion on blockchain. I also want to thank you because I'm sure you had lots of alternative ways to spend your evening this evening, so thank you for spending the evening with us. I will say that you've made a good decision, however, because we have 5 excellent speakers this evening, and all of whom will then join me for a panel discussion. And I think it's great that we're moving beyond the theory of blockchain into the practical applications of blockchain, and that's the focus. That's what all of our presenters will be discussing, and that's what the panel will also focus on. My role is pretty much to get out of the way. So I'm here to just keep time, introduce the speakers, and to facilitate the discussion. But it would be really good if it was an interactive discussion. So we have 40 minutes set aside for that panel, and it would be great if at least half of it could be taken up with questions from you. So as we go through the presentations, please bear in mind questions that you'd like to ask the panelists to clarify or to dig deeper into any of the topics that are raised. So the first of our presenters this evening is Bryan Ford, Professor Bryan Ford. And I have his bio here. I'm not going to read it out. What I will say is that it consists of lots of awards and a fantastic career, including time spent at MIT, Yale, before coming to EPFL. The one thing I will focus on is that Bryan is one of a handful of academics who have built a complete blockchain system. And I think that gives him a unique insight into what is good and what is bad about blockchain, what are the shortcomings of some of the public blockchains that are in existence, and also how those shortcomings may be overcome. So please welcome to the stage our first speaker, Professor Bryan Ford.
Great, thank you. Great. Thank you so much. Yeah. It's great to be here. Welcome, and thank you for coming. So in this talk, I was asked to first introduce the basic concept of blockchain for those of you who might not already be thoroughly versed in it, and then I'll talk a little bit about what my lab has been doing to try to advance the state of the art in blockchain systems. So why blockchain? Why is this concept of interest at all? I'll give you my perspective. I'm a security privacy researcher, so my focus is on building secure and privacy preserving systems. And so to me, it all comes down to risk, data risk, risk of compromise of data. And you've all probably seen, regularly in the news, all kinds of compromises happening all the times. Millions of users' data records getting compromised, and bad things happening to people, their data, their economic livelihoods, and a fundamental reason why all of this is happening is because as our digital systems get bigger and more complex and more interconnected, there are more points of entry, more points at which an attacker can, get in, compromise a system, and our current systems are built on what I call a weakest link security model, meaning the attacker typically only has to find one or a few small hairline fractures in a hugely complex system, and it's always possible to find those. And as our systems get bigger, they tend to get weaker in this design, more vulnerable to security vulnerabilities, right? Now, what does this have to do with blockchain? So, of course, blockchain is the big hot technology that has really, caught the world's attention. But what is it exactly? For those of you who aren't already familiar with it, for those of you who are, sorry if this is too basic. Basically, a blockchain is just a log or a ledger, just a record And it can be a record of any kind, a banking ledger, like a vehicle registration ledger, or a log of anything you like in particular. Just like a logbook on paper, a blockchain can potentially record any type of event. It's a log that you fill in from top to bottom. It's usually supposed to be a time-stamped record of events where you're supposed to only add things to the end and leave what was there already there. So that's supposed to happen. And so these can be any kind of events you might care about. If you care about alien abductions, you can keep an alien abduction log, whatever you like. But so why do we keep logs in general? And in turn, why is blockchain interesting? Well, usually the motivation for keeping logs, very often anyway, the motivation has something to do with security. Well, why is it useful for security to keep logs? Well, for example, companies keep visitor logs. When you come visit and you sign in and sign out, why is it that these logging and account keeping are standard practices? Why do companies keep logs of all times? Why do parents use baby monitors and webcams and all of these kinds of technologies? Well, it's really two fundamental things we want from these logs. First of all, transparency, so that if something goes wrong, the people who look at the log, or the system in the electronic world, systems looking at the log, have a chance to notice something wrong before it, for example, becomes catastrophic. And second, if something goes wrong, figure out what to do about it, who's to blame, what the recourse is, and so on. Accountability, right? And this is really the foundation of what a blockchain is providing in the tradition, in the digital world. Exactly the analog of logs in the traditional world. Now, there's an important problem, right? So a log kept in a single book, well, that's what we in the computer science community call a single point of failure or compromise. If somebody breaks in and steals or modifies the one master copy of the log, then they can, the thief can, cover their tracks, or destroy the evidence, or of some misbehavior, right? So, what can we do about that? Of course, we can put logs on paper and store them in a really secure safe or a secure location, make sure nobody breaks in. But another thing we can do is keep several copies, right? So don't just keep one copy of the log. Make sure that several people are keeping redundant copies of the log, and hope that if one does get attacked or modified or corrupted for whatever reason, the others won't, right? So this is a very basic idea, and it's also in widespread use long before the digital world. But it becomes especially important and useful in the digital world, where it's relatively cheap to make copies. Logs, information in a log is just information. It's relatively cheap in principle to make multiple copies of information and put copies of this log in multiple places, on multiple servers, and so on. Now, does this really improve our security, though, right? And it's important when thinking about what security we're actually getting, to think about, again, the single point of failure, single point of compromise problem. For example, if you have multiple copies of a digital log and they are spread across multiple servers in different places, but a single central security office has access to all of them, and an attacker, a thief or a malicious party breaks into that central security office and can modify all of them at once, then you haven't actually gotten much additional security from that, from that replication. You've gotten what we call availability. There's, stronger, a stronger hope that not all of them will disappear entirely. But if they can be maliciously modified all at once, then you haven't gotten fully security against malicious compromise. And then, of course, there's the human weak link problem. If one administrator, for example, has access to all of the copies of the log and their credentials get stolen, their access card or whatever, the password gets stolen, then the attacker can again modify everything all at once, and you haven't really gotten better security. So the point is to get to do a to get the real benefit of a replicated distributed log or a blockchain in the distributed world, you have to have three things. You have to have, well, the log itself. You have to keep them synchronized in some way so that they all, when things are operating normally, they all have the same thing. And they have to be kept independently so that no single party can compromise all of them at the same time, right? And so that's the essence of the idea of a blockchain. Replicated logs, synchronized using what we'll call a consensus algorithm, and some amount of independence in who keeps them and who has access to the copies, right? So, of course, the current mass of interest really started with Bitcoin a few years ago. Why Bitcoin? Why was this the spark of interest? Actually, most of the technologies, the concepts behind digital ledgers and blockchains existed in computer science for decades before this. But what Bitcoin did in a way is it somehow demonstrated to the rest of the world that these concepts of splitting trust, creating distributed ledgers is both possible and really useful, and it's no longer just an obscure computer science lab experiment anymore. It's Bitcoin made it real, which is really cool and exciting. So, without getting into too much detail about Bitcoin, what is the essence of what Bitcoin did? Well, it took a log or a ledger approach to wealth, right? Now, banks, especially banks in Switzerland, have been taking ledger approaches to wealth management for a long time, keeping track on a log of who has how much or who owes what to whom. That's old news. But Bitcoin basically wanted to do this in an all-electronic way without a single point of failure or compromise, without trusting any single party to keep a master copy of the ledger. And so Bitcoin's real interesting technical innovation was to find a way to create a digital ledger of this kind that can keep track of wealth, who owns how much Bitcoin, and so on, in a way that anybody can keep a copy. Anyone can participate in this process, can keep a copy and work with everybody else to maintain synchronization with these copies of the ledger. Now, I won't try to explain this, but this is just a classic illustration of what the Bitcoin blockchain looks like. It's called a blockchain because, well, it's a chain of blocks that are linked together cryptographically across the top. And each block, one of them represented by the rectangle on the bottom, contains a bunch of transactions that say things like Alice pays Bob 2 Bitcoins, right? That would actually be a lot of money right at the moment, but anyway, so that's the basic idea. It's just a ledger represented by a set of information blocks digitally with transactions in each block. Now, so I won't get any more into the technical details for now, but since Bitcoin became a big thing, it didn't take people long to realize that this idea, this widely distributed ledger idea that Bitcoin introduced was useful for a lot of other things besides cryptocurrencies. And a lot of the current blockchain interest, of course, has nothing to do with cryptocurrencies. Some does, but a lot doesn't. So blockchains and distributed ledgers can be used to track who owns other things besides currencies, things like names in a namespace or digital works of art. Blockchains can be used to enforce the terms of a contract and code a contract into the blockchain and enforce that automatically in this highly decentralized fashion. They can be used like notaries to timestamp documents and provide evidence that a particular document existed at a particular time. They can help track the provenance of items, and you'll hear more about some of these applications later. Handle personal identity and access to data, things like that. So there are many different applications that many people are envisioning and are interested in. And in fact, we've even seen the development in this space of essentially a new, very different, still somewhat unfamiliar and uncertain form of investment called the ICO, initial coin offering. Here, coin refers to basically a digital token that exists only on the blockchain and not a physical, stock share or something like that. So, and of course, interest in this and investment in this type of system has been exploding hugely. But that's, of course, not my main topic. So now I've told you, what a blockchain is and some of the areas of promise. And there is huge promise, and that's great. On the other hand, we also have to recognize the limitations, the major severe limitations of most of the currently deployed blockchains, and how far we still need to go in order to really bring this technology, to where it needs to be for a lot of these applications. So many of the current blockchains are slow. They have consistency limitations. They're limited in terms of privacy and so on. Especially looking at the so-called consensus process. So every blockchain, to keep a blockchain, you need to have a way to synchronize all these copies of the log or ledger, and that synchronization part turns out to be much harder than just making copies. Making copies is easy. What's hard is keeping them synchronized correctly. And Bitcoin introduced this very interesting, novel, but also somewhat broken in many ways, consensus protocol that we now call Nakamoto consensus, which had the advantage of being super scalable. It could easily support thousands or tens of thousands of participants directly in this consensus process, which was novel and very interesting. But it brings a lot of downsides. It's very slow, and it takes at least 10 minutes to commit something in Bitcoin, and you really should wait a lot longer than that to be certain that something's committed, that you've really received that money, because the chain can reorganize itself. You can lose the money because it decided, oh, I thought I had decided this way, but let's decide that way, at least within the recent period. It's also very limited in throughput and very wasteful of energy, as you've likely heard. There's other issues. For example, I mentioned this problem of independence. And one of the practical independence problems that many blockchains have is that most of the copies of the code running these ledgers are often exactly the same code. And if there's one bug in that code or one bug in a smart contract running on that blockchain, everybody running the same code, then an attacker finds that bug and can compromise all of the copies at once in the same way, right? And this kind of thing has happened repeatedly. One of the Ethereum-based smart contracts, an attacker exploited a bug to steal about $70 million, which was half of a big investment fund at that time. So blockchains, in some sense, and cryptocurrencies have been, people have said, blockchains have created a universal bug bounty. Any security vulnerability in your system, somebody will try to find it if they think you have some cryptocurrency in your system worth stealing, and that is the bug bounty that you didn't realize you were putting out there. So another major limitation is the way many, especially the public blockchains, decide who gets to participate in this consensus process and how many votes each participant wields. And this is based on this process of mining, which is literally just proving you wasted energy for no purpose other than to prove you wasted energy as an artificial barrier to entry, right? So And so because of the economic incentives led these miners to to want to compete more and more on Bitcoin, they've created these entire data centers that are now dedicated to wasting energy in order to prove they wasted massive amounts of energy in order to mine Bitcoin, right? And Ethereum and other blockchains. And so this type of blockchain is literally what I call a scorched earth blockchain. Its purpose is in essence nothing but to make participants prove that they have contributed their share to destroying the planet environmentally in order to mine some Bitcoin. So if you've ever seen worse incentive alignment, tell me, because this is I consider this pretty amazing and horrifying. So at last count, it looked, I believe Bitcoin is now wasting more energy than about 159 countries are using productively to live on. And so, so we need to, this is a huge problem we need to solve. And we're not actually getting good security or decentralization from this because most of the mining power is highly concentrated for economic incentive reasons. And this is not at all a unique problem to Bitcoin. Most of the public cryptocurrencies have this problem in different forms. They're not that decentralized, not that secure by many metrics. And so, so this is a huge problem that we have to solve. So, and backing up, looking at the blockchain market as a whole, because it's such a hot topic, most of the people and companies investing in it don't have time to keep up on all of the details or understand all of the details of what they're investing in. And this gets back to a problem that one of the Nobel Prize winners in economics observed, that whenever in markets where sellers have a lot more information about product quality than buyers, quality tends to go down because the first to market wins, and the first to market is usually the lower quality product that cut a lot of quarters rather than getting it right. And we are, I guarantee we are in the midst of a blockchain lemon market where, a lot of the first to market products are very compromised in many ways in terms of quality and security. And so I want to offer that warning. So anyway, but nevertheless, with those negatives in mind, I'm still extremely excited about blockchain. I would not be here otherwise. And so I just wanted to spend a couple minutes giving you a sense for what my lab at EPFL has been trying to do to fix some of these issues and build better blockchains. And so I've been working in this broad space of decentralized systems, long before blockchain became a thing for the last 20 years or so. And my overall objective is really to figure out how to redesign our systems to replace this weakest link security model with the strongest link security model. And basically to build systems that get more secure as they get bigger and more complex, rather than getting less secure as they scale, right? We want to scale to better security rather than to weaker security. And, so this is not easy, and it's a long project that many people in labs around the world are working on. But in particular, we're trying to build blockchains that are much faster, more scalable, can handle more transactions, more privacy preserving, and more powerful in all sorts of ways. So these challenges are not easy, and all of this is still a big work in progress for many labs and companies around the world. Just a quick sample of a couple of our projects in the space. One we published earlier this year that focuses on the scalability problem. How do we build blockchains that can handle not just 4 or 7 transactions per second globally like Bitcoin and Ethereum can, but how can we build a blockchain that handles thousands or tens of thousands of transactions per second, that scales as big as you want just by adding more resources? And so OmniLedger basically does that by taking an arbitrarily large set of participants or resources and dividing them up in a secure, random fashion into smaller shards. each of which can take on just a part of the processing and data storage problem and make the system scale. So this is a capability that we take for granted in cloud computing. You know, cloud computing has been doing this forever, but in a completely centralized fashion where you have to trust one party. Doing this in a way where you don't have single points of failure and you don't have to trust just one party, that's where the difficulty lies. And so OmniLedger does that. I also want to briefly mention the privacy challenge with blockchains. So by default, when you spread around lots of copies of data, you are helping the integrity, protect the integrity of the data, but you're just making privacy worse by, you know, giving a lot of people copies of the data, right? And so because of this, most current blockchains, if you want to, you know, put anything private on the blockchain, you either just don't do that, or you put something called a cryptographic commitment or an encryption of the data on the blockchain. But the keys, the private data or the keys to the private data still have to stay off the blockchain in the hands of a single party. And that single party tends to remain a single point of failure or compromise. And so another project that my lab has been working on has been to build an architecture that allows you to entrust secrets in the blockchain, to the blockchain themselves, encrypt something care of the blockchain in such a way that the blockchain will collectively protect with no single point of failure, both the security and the privacy of that data. And so, you know, without getting into more details, I'll just briefly mention that we're in the process of using this for a number of applications. One in the personalized health space with a project called DPPH, the Data Protection in Personalized Health. Another project hosted at EPFL, the Swiss Data Science Center, which is managing data and processes for research. We've also explored applications of this to Internet of Things devices, for example, keeping large networks of devices up to date with security critical patches and making sure there's no single point of compromise in that whole software supply chain and update process. And finally, one last blockchain application we've explored is building an experimental e-voting system, which, so this is not intended, at least currently, for e-voting at large, say, for the public at large, but currently for e-voting within institutions, and we're now using it within EPFL to handle the voting for the yearly EPFL school assembly, in which about 10,000 internal EPFL people, students and faculty and staff vote. So we've been working with a lot of industry partners on adopting this technology, and it's becoming part of the Center for Digital Trust, the suite of the Center for Digital Trust. We're very excited about the C4DT and how that's further accelerating some of this work. But I'll leave it at that for now. So I've told you hopefully what a blockchain is, what some of its promise is, limitations, and some of what we're trying to do to address those limitations. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Bryan, for that presentation. I think, as you said, you covered an enormous amount of ground in 30 minutes. What a blockchain is, the basics, the promise of blockchain, the shortcomings, and how those shortcomings might be overcome, and how we can engineer better blockchains in the future. And I think you've set us up very well for the next speakers and the topics that we're now going to explore. The first of which is the application of blockchain in the realm of government. And to present, I'm going to ask Gianfranco Moy to come to the stage. So Gianfranco is the Deputy Director of the Directorate of Economic Development, Research and Innovation at the State of Geneva. He is the founder of the Geneva Lab, the living lab of the State of Geneva's Administration for the Digital Transformation of Public Services and Economic Development through Open Innovation. So the floor is yours, Gianfranco. We look forward to learning more about the Geneva lab. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. Maybe the first thing I want to say that I have slightly changed the title of my speech. I have added a question mark to it. To be honest with you, I don't have the answer to that question. We are experimenting today. Blockchain in public administration is like teenage sex. You know, everybody is talking about it, nobody is really doing it, and then everybody else thinks everyone is on it. That's what we are currently experiencing in this field, and I'm going to talk to you about a few experiments that we have done in Geneva. That being said, and to be more serious about it, we are trying to become very blockchain friendly in Geneva. We have several initiatives. In particular, we have published a guide for ICOs that will facilitate preparing the ICOs and be more successful here in Geneva. And this is something that I will not cover in this topic now. Some of you may be familiar with this graph. Basically shows the hype cycle. And here we see that the blockchain, that's published by the Gartner Group, the blockchain is now behind the peak of higher expectations. And we have, as we try to implement it in the real world, experienced some issues that have been eloquently described by Bryan. So I want to dwell with these issues, but what is important for our topic here regarding public administration, there are too many things. One is the jurisdiction and applicable law, and the other issue is about trust. So let's go back to what the state, the administration, civil society, business, and environment interaction is about. If you look at a very broad picture, the state intervenes in civil society in many ways. There's some security, social issues, intervenes also in the economy, and this is done through public policies and laws. The law itself is usually not directly applicable, so that's the job of the state administration to come up with the additional fill in the gaps, basically to make it actionable. And so it's a complex system. The state administration creates regulations that complement the law, defines processes, procedures, and ultimately keep the official records of what the society, the business, and the environment is about. And there's a feedback loop here where civil society, business, but also the environment provides feedback to the system through election votes, lobbying for the business, and also just biodiversity and climate change are some of the feedbacks that we're getting. So now I want to focus on the role of the administration. I mentioned it's a complex structure. At the top, we have several units, offices, departments, and so forth, that are in charge of basically describing this regulation, that is additional information to make the law applicable. And then this is declined in processes and procedures, who does what, responsible for doing what, and eventually we produce official records. So if we want to change the administration as a system, we see that there is an increasing reluctance to change as you move from the bottom of the stack up. It's easier to change the way we store, for instance, official records, than it is to change, for instance, the organization and defining who is in charge of basically applying the law. Going back to the trust issue regarding administration, we trust the administration in its third-party trusted role in many ways. We trust the administration to plan, to communicate, measure, provide incentive, authorize some behaviors, restrict others, and sanction when the behavior is outside the realm of the law. Sometimes the administration also performs some tasks, regulate, and so forth. And eventually, as I was saying before, there's some recording in registries of the official statements, the official information. So blockchain provides just a unique opportunity to transform this system, and there is a real potential to improve the efficiency, reliability of the public administration to blockchain. But for that, there is a prerequisite. The administration has to work within the framework of a law, and the law has to be applicable in the digital realm. So what is the State of Geneva administration digital legal context? Some of these laws are federal laws. Just recently, a law has been enacted to be able to have official digital records, which is just a must. Without that, you don't go very far. There is a law about the digital signature that is now available and allows basically to have the same rights in signing digitally than you have signing manually. There is a law that is being voted, I hope, this first half of 2019 that will also allow for a consistent electronic identification of the different parties. And also we have some local laws, for instance, in the administration for providing the online services that the state provides to citizens and businesses. All that is, of course, to be compliant with the data protection law that is in Switzerland different from what it is now in Europe. And we have some issues of alignment of the GDPR with the LPD that we are still dealing with. I want just very briefly touch on two use cases that we have experienced in Geneva, the State of Geneva. The first one is to basically have the State of Geneva play the role of an oracle, that is Oracle, not the Allison company. I'm talking about Oracle on the blockchain, that is to be the source of verifiable information. And we have devised an experiment, a proof of concept, and we developed that within a minimal viable product on the business registry extract. And I'll get to that in just a short while. The second use case that we have identified, this is a legitimate role for the administration to have, is basically to increase the trust level partners to a business transaction have when they identify the parties to a contract. And here we have not started the experiment, but we are designing the architecture for this. It's applied to a particular case of business. It's commodity trade finance. It is a fairly important industry here in Geneva. The first experiment is about registries. We have hundreds of registers that we manage at the state. We issue certificates, permits, authorization requests, and so forth. So there's a lot of activity that goes around these registers, and we believe that the blockchain can provide a way to simplify that. So our first proof of concept was about the business case on the registry extract process. It's fairly simple. Step one, you basically go to our website, you request the extract for a business. It's submitted to the office. The office then retrieves the information from their certified register and then records it in the blockchain, and you receive back the certificate with the document that you can then verify. So this is the way it looks on the website. You just submit your request, and then you get back the document with the certificate that you can verify. So the blockchain is completely transparent to the whole process to the end user. And I think that's the way we should keep it if you want this to be successful, this to be very simple to use. The second use case here is about the commodity trade finance transactions that we talk about here. The role of the administration is, and I won't go into the details of this, we don't have time, but let me address some of the questions that will come up maybe during the session. The role here is to better identify the parties to a transaction, and so basically using the digital signature in a contract, the state will also provide a better check of the identity of the people who are actually signing these contracts, and just provide an additional level of trust in the transaction. that's all I wanted to cover today, and it's very brief, and I went fast, only 10 minutes to present the topic, but if you need additional information, I put my contact information here, and well, this picture was taken before I started working on the blockchain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gianfranco. So, yeah, a big topic to cover in 10 minutes. So, but anyway, we can explore it further on the panel, and if you have questions, you can address those to Gianfranco in a few minutes. I think it's very encouraging to hear that the state is experimenting with blockchain. I think there's a big potential for governments to become platforms themselves and facilitating commerce. So that is great to hear. Okay, so next up we have Charlotte Lindsay-Curte, who's going to be talking about the use of blockchain in the humanitarian sector. Charlotte is the Director of Digital Transformation and Data at the International Committee of the Red Cross, and her responsibilities there include developing the ICRC's data model, data analytics and data governance, the design, testing and build of the ICRC's capacity for digital response services and engagement with stakeholders, and the enabling of the ICRC's capacity for digital transformation. And Charlotte's going to be talking about, I think in broad terms, about how technology can help the humanitarian sector. So Charlotte, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I don't have a presentation for you today. I'm just going to give you some overview of some of the important aspects from the humanitarian perspective. So the International Committee of the Red Cross, for those of you who don't know it, is the building sitting up at the top of the hill, which is an organization which is 154 years old, developed to bring protection and assistance to victims of armed conflict. And so you may wonder why a humanitarian organization working in more than 80 armed conflicts around the world is looking at things like blockchain and new technologies. Well, I hope to give a sort of brief explanation of that this evening. Bryan mentioned trust, risk, privacy. All of those aspects are critical for the ICRC because we hold an enormous amount of data on individuals which are victims of armed conflict or stakeholders in situations of armed conflict. And so when we look at the digital transformation of the ICRC, we also have to look at how all those aspects related to privacy, trust, transformation, and through the use of new technologies, how is that going to impact the way we work, our capacity to respond, but also how will it affect the lives of those we're there to protect and assist? And blockchain is probably, since I have been looking at this over the last 2 or 3 years, it's the subject that that I'm most asked about in terms, or approached about by people coming to me from outside the sector, from tech companies, from startups, saying, we have a great blockchain use for you. And what I want to give you tonight is just a quick overview of some of those decision things that we have to bear in mind when we look at this, and a particular use case that we did feel was worth exploring and why. So blockchain, everybody is talking about it. As you say, it's like teenage sex. Everybody's talking, how many people doing it? And I think that the issue in this regard has been really critical to try to understand what is the problem we're trying to resolve. And I think for most new technologies, that is the question. But a lot of the use cases that are presented to the ICRC, there is already a very good technological capacity to respond without the use of blockchain. So we have to look and say, is there really a problem that blockchain is resolving, or are we just trying to leverage a new technology because it exists? And then what is required? Most of those cases, and I now know to describe them as lemons, so most of those that come forward are not really particularly relevant because of the aspects that they're not able to deliver for us. The types of use cases which in the humanitarian sector are being widely discussed in relation to blockchain technology are particularly about the use of cash transfers for humanitarian assistance. So to cut out the need for direct delivery of humanitarian assistance and provide cash or voucher assistance through a form of cryptocurrency or blockchain, or biometric payment systems, management of vehicle fleets, logistics, supply chain management, and also more and more frequently how blockchain can be used to create digital identities or also citizenship for those that have lost their digital identity papers or their citizenship because they have fled their country of origin or because the status of their country of origin is being fought for. So if we look today, there are 66 million people on the move, the largest number since the Second World War. So we are at a time when people are saying the blockchain is a way of potentially resolving that notion of creating a digital identity for those who would want to be able to, who need a digital identity to access the sorts of support that they would need in the host country they are. What I would say in generally is in relation to blockchain, most of the examples that are put forward, we do see that there is a potential for them to be transformational, but still it's a very nascent technology where there are a lot of issues that need to be resolved, particularly if you want to apply it to the humanitarian sector, where we're not talking about contracts or cash transfer, we're actually talking about lives being involved and at stake. We do see that the decentralized aspect of blockchain is very promising, but still more development is needed in terms of how to scale them, as you mentioned, Bryan, in terms of managing the energy consumption aspects, the security, and particularly the privacy aspects for individuals. That being said, there are a number of cases for the humanitarian sector that the ICSC has particularly been approached about, where we have been over the last 1.5 to 2 years exploring the implications of this and doing our own due diligence as to, is this A, an applicable use of blockchain, and B, what might this mean for the ICSC if we decided to take this on or engage with it. And I want to give you one example in this, which is the use of blockchain to provide a reliable means for combatants and neutral parties to engage in conflict zones, to communicate about predefined signs and signals in making targeting decisions. So to have a protocol which exists to register those protected places under international humanitarian law that should not be targeted, and that the blockchain can be a holder of the geolocation of that. So, for example, ICSC would geolocate its premises or could be hospitals or it could be cultural property, that protocol would be on a ledger that is then able to be assessed by those who make targeting decisions with regard to the conduct of hostilities to see whether it is a relevant target. If the ICSC had put that, according to the protocol, on the ledger, then in making a targeting decision, you would look at that and say the source of that is the ICSC. Okay, the International Committee of the Red Cross is a trusted, right? We would be very careful, we should be very careful about making any targeting decisions there. We feel this has been a use of blockchain which is highly relevant in that there's a real humanitarian purpose behind that. We feel it's a relevant use because it's about the use of a ledger, a trusted ledger where it is immutable, it is somewhere that you can then connect back to the source of who's put something on the ledger, with a view to making real life decisions about whether you should target something or not. We have been, as I say, for 1.5 years exploring and doing due diligence behind this for all the other reasons that are necessary to look at the implications of blockchain. For example, the transparency is clear, but then the accountability. What if there is a targeting error? What does that mean? Will somebody then be taken to court about that? What is the implications of that? Would all parties be ready to do that? What does it mean to have your geolocation there? Will it make you more of a target or less? So we have been looking at all of those different aspects and to see what this means, but also for ICSC to understand how blockchain works, because we know this technology will be more and more used in the humanitarian setting, so it's a good way for ICSC to engage and to try to understand what this means. And so we're in the process of verification and validation testing at the moment to see whether that is something that the ICSC feels it can engage with or put its name to. The other types of examples are really things that are around cash distribution where we actually feel there's a lot of A, alternatives which exist today, but B, a fundamental issue of how do you protect the privacy of individuals is not yet able to be addressed, even though there are sort of encryption aspects that are ongoing. And that's primarily because you may want to be forgotten, you may not want your identity registered permanently on the blockchain, and what do you do about that? And that is very critical in situations of armed conflict where individuals' lives are at stake. The ICSE has been running for the last couple of years a series on data protection for humanitarian settings with the Brussels Privacy Hub. And we've developed a handbook on data protection for humanitarian settings where we've looked at a lot of new technologies. The second series we're running at the moment is looking at blockchain digital identities and trying to identify the operational, legal, technical challenges involved in using that type of technology in a humanitarian setting. Part of the reason, and I will conclude on this, that we engage with EPFL, and you will have seen the ICSE logo as part of the C42 DT, the Center for Digital Trust at EPFL, and the partnerships we have with EPFL are to leverage the expertise of people like Professor Bryan Ford to be able to develop technologies, but do the due diligence behind that in a way that the ICSE is able to leverage the opportunities and manage the risk. And for that, with EPFL, we're looking at algorithmic reading. We've been developing algorithms to read conflict environments and looking at different privacy-enhancing technologies that we can co-develop with EPFL with a view to ensuring that as we do our digital transformation, that we're putting privacy first, that we're recognizing the protection challenges of individuals around the world, and the fact that many of these technologies are still in their infancy, so we have to be able to do the necessary work behind on the back office part of that to make sure that if ICSE uses a technology, or ICSE puts its name to a blockchain or others, that is done in a way that we can give assurance to our staff, but also the beneficiaries and stakeholders that we are there to protect and assist, that we are reliant on this, but that we have also done the necessary due diligence to ensure that we are not putting lives in peril. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. So I think one of the issues that Charlotte raised was the difficulty of marrying privacy with blockchain, which is a topic that we'll come back to in the panel discussion later on. So next up we have Dr. Marko Vukulic, I hope I've said that right, who's a research staff member at IBM Research in Zurich. He's an EPFL alumnus. He received his PhD from EPFL in distributed systems in 2008. His research interests lie in the broad area of distributed systems, cloud computing, distributed storage, and fault tolerance. And he's going to be talking about some of the use cases that IBM is working on in its labs. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. So I'll start with a few words of how I got into this blockchain world and how IBM got into blockchain world. So I actually got into blockchain world like in 2003 without knowing it, right? Because I was doing my PhD at EPFL in distributed systems, notably consensus in untrusted environments. So when I was defending my thesis, my family asked me, like, do you see application of this? This was 2008, right? I think this is just theoretical, right? So you can basically from this, as this coincides with the appearance of Bitcoin in 2008, you can see that I'm not Satoshi, for example. But then I joined IBM in 2015, and since 2015 I'm working in IBM on blockchain use cases. So basically this is already 4 years, and what we are focusing in IBM is to bring the blockchain technologies to different businesses. So I was asked by the organizers here to talk about blockchain use cases, like real-world use cases, and the networks, like preferably live networks, but they don't have to do with finance, like fintech applications, currencies, or anything like that. And they're actually, so what we do in IBM is kind of overview on this slide, but there are like several areas which are definitely not related to fintech. Like fintech would be more on the left side, and then there are use cases that are related to provenance or digital identity, healthcare, insurance, also government, distributed energy that don't necessarily have to do with fintech. So there are actually quite a few of them. And this is only, so this slide is only what IBM is doing, so actually the whole picture is much broader. So I'm going to focus on a few of these. So I selected provenance and the food safety, digital identity, and supply chain use case. So the provenance use case up there is related to diamond provenance, but actually I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to talk about another provenance use case, which is related to food safety. And there, essentially what happens is, so the network that I'm describing here is called Food Trust, and it's a live network since a few months ago, where actually the goal is to bring the participants in food chain supply, not only to track on this ledger that essentially Bryan described, to track events related to food as a supply, to food production as a supply chain use case, but also to track food safety on there. Because you can imagine that when you have a food recall, you can easily track back on a blockchain to basically identify where the contamination of the food or where the certificate failed when a regulatory agency was analyzing this food sample. So this motivation for this kind of use cases comes from, I guess, from Bitcoin, where in Bitcoin you don't have this, like, it's a digital cash, but it's kind of not, because digital cash is anonymous, but Bitcoins you can track back on the ledger, because there is whole history of how this Bitcoin changes hands. Essentially, you can track this back on Bitcoin, and we are using this to track provenance of different goods, and notably in this example, food safety. So that's one example, right? When this provenance makes sense for like, I would say, non-fintech use cases of blockchain. The other one is related to supply chain, and there is again, this is a second live network that IBM is participating in. It's called TradeLens. It originated in a network from IBM and Maersk, and it's for basically for container and shipping tracking. Maersk and IBM started the network, and then the idea was to actually onboard port authorities, different other basically carriers, and all different players that are enrolled in such a basically in such a supply chain use case. The network is live. It has its own issues, which I'm ready to discuss with you during the panel, right? And it's actually very interesting, and it doesn't have to do with technology, but it has to do with something else. But essentially, these are the examples in which you have blockchain, like real blockchain use cases. And again, I'm talking about live networks that don't have to do with cryptocurrencies. And but they could do, right? So you could couple the supply chain use case whenever, for example, container arrives to the port. You could have RFIDs that basically scan this event, and this is how it's actually recorded now on this network. But you could also have this trigger immediate payment of the parties involved. So you can actually play with this. So you can have the use case that combines some sort of tokens, maybe the token representation of fiat currency, which we call stable coins or stable tokens, and you can mix these kind of use cases, right? For example, currently in Food Trust, what we actually have is there are no tokens, and as far as I know, in TradeLens as well. So the third example that I want to discuss here is actually a very interesting one. So this is trusted identity, and it's about the sovereign network that IBM actually didn't bootstrap. Unlike the first two networks, IBM didn't have to do anything about bootstrapping this network, but it's actually a partner in such a network. And the idea for sovereign network is to enable, actually Bryan mentioned it in one of his slides, to enable like people and other entities to have self-sovereign identity. So what does this mean? This means, like, on one hand, to facilitate how you identify yourself on the internet, like without having to use the tons of username and passwords, what we do now, but also to basically decentralize currently centralized certificate authorities that are essentially issuing digital certificates. So to have essentially, if you want, blockchain as a certificate authority, decentralized one. And then you could even build economies around this. So you could have some some players in the network that would actually claim some facts about your identity, which you can actually come up with by yourself with a sort of a self-signed certificate. But then you have other entities on the network that will actually bring more value to this identity of yours, right? And then what sovereign network aims to be is designed specifically for this use case, so only for digital identity. And it might enable also like new business models that are around, for example, certification or enrichment of these digital identities. Okay, so I have here a survey of other use cases, right? So these are not, basically I selected 3 live networks that don't have to do with fintech, but there are others. So many of them, like these loyalty programs, sorry, I'm just reading this randomly now, citizen identity. And so in IBM, we have many proof of concepts around this, not necessarily in live network still, and these 3 use cases that I described are live networks. So what I do in my day-to-day work and what I like focusing on is actually building the technology to enable this. So what we did in the last 4 years since IBM entered the blockchain space is we tried to have because all these use cases have some common ground, right? So food safety can in some sense is similar to supply chain use case, right? So how do you build a blockchain that enables easily these networks without rebuilding them from scratch? So what we did is we designed and implemented Hyperledger Fabric, initial version of it that we donated to the open source community back in 2016. So since then it's an open source effort actually managed by the Linux Foundation. So we built it as an operating system for permission blockchains. There is no deployment of Hyperledger Fabric. It's actually the software that you use to power permissioned blockchain deployment. And its basically defining feature is that it doesn't have a systemic or native cryptocurrency, unlike basically all the other blockchains that you have heard of. And it's precisely designed in such a way to enable these use cases that bring the benefits of the distributed ledger technology without relying on cryptocurrency. And that essentially, I don't have time to talk about it, but that actually required complete redesign of how blockchains work. And along that, in doing this, we also enabled programming smart contracts in general purpose languages, which is also a unique feature, at least at the time when we came up with the design of Hyperledger Fabric. So one last, basically I have 10 seconds left, just a slide on Hyperledger as a project. So Hyperledger Fabric is just one project of the Hyperledger family of the projects. And this is the Linux Foundation project that is aimed to bring blockchain technology to businesses. So Hyperledger Fabric is one project, but there are others. And it's an emblematic project, I would say, in a sense that it brings, you cannot see all these logos of all these companies that participate in the project, but it's on purpose. This is to impress you because there are more 250 big companies actually present in the project. And if your company is not there, you should join the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. Okay, last but definitely not least, we have Adrian Tricani from Meteco. So Adrian is another EPFL alumnus. He's actually still lectures at the EPFL on distributed ledgers. And I'll let him introduce his company. Just in the interest of full transparency, it's a marketplace provider. So if I get really excited and wax very positive, that might be the reason. But it's allowing banks to play an important and ongoing role in the world of cryptocurrencies and digital assets. So Adrian, please tell us more.
Thank you very much, Ben. So it's a great pleasure to be here today to speak a little bit about how you would store cryptocurrencies, how you would manage cryptocurrencies. We have a fantastic introduction on how blockchain works, how you can use it in different contexts, how you can create different sorts of blockchains that serve different purposes or are more powerful, more scalable. I want to explain how difficult it is to use a blockchain, even if it is the fastest one and the most secure one. Let me just start with a little story. When I discovered Bitcoin in 2012, and I like to repeat this story, maybe some of you have already heard it, there were maybe 3 or 4 exchanges on the market, and all of them had different prices. Some of them were priced $20 for Bitcoin, other ones were priced $25. If you work a little bit in finance, you should immediately conclude that you're able to extract some value by buying where it's inexpensive and selling where it's expensive. So as a PhD student, this is exactly what I did. I started building a solution to buy and sell at the same time in an automatized fashion and started generating profits. But I had forgotten two things, which unfortunately didn't allow me to continue for a long time. First thing was, at the end of the day, I had to rebalance all of the portfolios. And this is an operation which takes time, because you have to go through the banking system. And at some point, moving hundreds of thousands of dollars every week started triggering red flags at the bank. And we found a solution to continue, which was to try to use multiple bank accounts. And it's still shady, but it worked. Second thing, which is even worse, is that after a couple of months, some of the exchanges, 2 out of the 4, went bankrupt, and they left with the money. So something that looked like a very smooth curve going up with arbitrage profits ended up being not so profitable in the medium term. And this is all related to how difficult it is to store and manage cryptocurrencies. Initially, when Bitcoin was invented, the even ambition of Bitcoin was to somehow get rid of banks. We don't like to say too much today, but initially that was still the goal, to compete with central banks and compete with banks, and provide a system where individuals can use a currency or an asset without ever relying on a third party. Well, if you follow the news, you've probably realized that since 2008, there have been probably billions of dollars worth of cryptocurrencies being lost or stolen. And there is one reason for that. The whole security of cryptocurrencies and crypto assets relies on a single notion of private key. A private key is a very long password that is so long that it has pretty much the same number of combinations as the number of atoms in the universe. And you generate this random number by taking a dice, you roll it multiple times on your table, and you write the numbers on your piece of paper, you fold the piece of paper and put it somewhere in a safe deposit, and this is your wallet. This is your secret. That is the unique access points to your Bitcoin reserves. Of course, if your piece of paper is lost, destroyed, or stolen, your money is gone. But you could still put this piece of paper in security. Now think about if you store this key, I don't know, in your computer or in the server of a company. You've all seen of these stories about companies losing your credit card numbers. And with a credit card number, at least you can call your lawyer if there is a problem, or you can call Visa or MasterCard, and they will solve the problem. They will renew the card, change the number, and probably give you the money back. Well, with cryptocurrencies, once you've been subject to a leak of your private key, this is too late. You can't call your lawyer. You can't call the judge or your daddy. It's too late. You can't do anything. So you have to have a system that you can trust. And there have been a lot of solutions now on the market to help you do that as a private individual, a private citizen that wants to just store some Bitcoins under the mattress. What we start seeing already is that the initial purpose of Bitcoin, you try to bypass banks. Well, slowly but surely, we see that most investors actually prefer relying on a bank or a trusted third party to do the dirty job for them. So most investors today, they just use companies that act as custodians and provide a highly secure service, or at least we hope highly secure service, that prevents you, that avoids you managing the private keys by yourself. You can just use it as an e-banking platform the same way you would use it for Swiss francs, euro, or dollars. Now again, this is not a perfect world, and if you've seen again the news in the last 5 years, even companies have failed at using these private keys and providing a secure service to you as an investor. Billions of dollars worth of these cryptocurrencies have been lost also in the corporate world. Some of the crypto exchanges that were managing 60% of the whole trading volume in 2013 have entirely gone bankrupt and lost most of their reserves. So it's extremely difficult. So getting back to now what we do. I'm the CEO of a company called Metaco, and we've realized now a few years ago that at some point banks would get in. And the same way internet did not remove post from business, cryptocurrencies are not going to remove banks from business. Banks are just going to adapt and start offering services that are adapted to this environment. What is the first service that banks are going to feel comfortable with? It's the concept of storage, and then it's the concept of trading. Well, to store cryptocurrencies, you need to have an infrastructure that is ready for this. So what we do at Metaco is precisely offer banks with a technology, with hardware, high security hardware, that is able to manage private keys, manage the processes to deal with the transactions in a way that security is maximized and the risk of loss is minimized. But this is not that simple. I could speak about it for hours. This is not the objective of today. We have a panel in a moment about this. But of course, as I mentioned, you could do it in a very simple way to make it very secure. What you would do is take this piece of paper with your key and put it in a safe deposit. But think about it. Every time you want to spend your money, then you want to go underground in a safe deposit, extract this private key, put it on a computer, which is a slow process and a risky process, obviously. So you can have this kind of high security thing on a piece of paper, but it is not very available. Every time you want to use your money, it takes time. Banks can't afford that. If you are on an e-banking platform and you want to spend money, you probably want to have the money going out immediately, or at least fast. So it is always a trade-off between security and availability. And this is exactly where our company is very strong at. We don't claim that we have a solution that is the most secure on the market, because you can always be more secure by making it harder to access the money. But we have the perfect trade-off between providing high security and still a high degree of availability, a good access to the market. And therefore we help banks starting offering services related to cryptocurrencies, crypto assets, and whether it's Bitcoin or whether it's some other use case, whether it's smart contracts for supply chain management. In any case, you always have to interface yourself with the blockchain with keys. And this is what we're very good at, and this is really where we expect banks to go in the future. And we will see in the coming weeks and coming months that more and more banks are getting involved, and many of them are getting involved with us. So thank you very much.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the panel discussion now. And the intention is to ask each one of the panelists one follow-up question based on their presentation. And then I'm going to move to talk about some general questions in relation to blockchain. And then I'm going to ask you to ask your questions. So I think we have at least 2 mics that will be roaming at that point. And the intention is to leave at least 15, 20 minutes for your questions. So be ready with those, if you will. Okay, so we'll start with Bryan. So Bryan, your presentation followed a perfect narrative arc, right? Because you talked about the promise of blockchain, you talked about the issues of blockchain, and then you concluded by saying that those issues are surmountable, they're solvable. And the 2 things that you talked about, I think, were sharding and encryption. And my question is, firstly, could you go into slightly more detail about those 2 solutions? And then secondly, can sharding and encryption, can they solve the issues of public blockchains, or existing public blockchains? Or do we need to introduce new blockchains into the market?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. So first of all, to answer the second part of your question first, sharding and encryption are 2 really critical pieces to move things forward, but they're definitely not the only critical ones. A third would be for example, the mining problem, or the problem of deciding who gets a vote and who gets how much of a vote. And that also needs to be completely reconsidered in the public blockchain scenario. In private blockchains like Hyperledger, that's less of a problem. In terms of sharding, that's a technique to achieve massive scalability, to get the kind of scalability that we already take for granted in clouds. Our work pushes that forward in being able to bring that scalability to widely distributed public or private blockchains. But there's a lot more to be done in that space as well. For example, the shards in our systems are randomly chosen, which is the best for security, actually, in this context. Just trust me on that for now. But that a random choice is not the best for latency, for fast transactions, because if the members of a shard are random, then they're probably spread all over the world, which means to commit one transaction, you still have to bounce network packets all over the world, right? And so from a performance perspective, it would be better to make shards more local, for example, geographically local within a city or a data center. But doing that carries security and risk trade-offs. It centralizes the participants more as well, which means that a potential attacker or compromise in one location might have more of a chance of hitting, too many members of the shard at once. So, so I think we're heading in the right direction, but there's a lot more work to be done in the whole scaling space. And then on the privacy side, I think, again, we've taken a few steps along the way to figuring out how to deal with privacy in the blockchain context. We've already, several of the basic steps are already standard practice. For example, if you have private data, a lot of projects just say, okay, keep that data off the blockchain, like Sovereign does, like Marco mentioned. Keep it off the blockchain in private devices, in the user's own devices, for example, and just put a hash or a commit to that in the blockchain. That will ensure that when you use that data later, you can prove that it's existed back then and it hasn't been tampered with, while still keeping it private. That's important. That's a very important, useful capability. But the blockchain won't ensure that the data is actually remembered. It will not make sure that the data is there when you need it. For example, if the data only exists on your one device and your one device gets stolen, the blockchain can't possibly help you to recover it in that case. So somebody has to remember it for you then, right? And so, so another step you can take is to entrust, encrypt it, and trust the keys to a private party, perhaps a very secure vault of digital or physical, and so you can solve it that way. But then you're fundamentally getting the decentralized trust benefit of the blockchain for the integrity part, but not for the privacy part. You're relying on a single party for the privacy part. Right? So, a further step along that path is to figure out how can we get this distributed trust property for both the integrity part and the privacy part. And that's another major step we're working on taking. We're making some progress, but again, it's a work in progress. And then beyond that, yet another step. How do you not only entrust private data to the blockchain and provide decentralized integrity and privacy, but how do you then process that data, do calculations with it in the blockchain, be able to execute smart contracts on private data, without any single party. And that's really, we have technology that can do that, but that, things like homomorphic encryption and secure multi-party computation, but at the moment, these kinds of technologies are like millions of times slower and more expensive, than just ordinary computation. So they're not feasible for many applications. But it's out there. It's feasible for some things. It's another step in this kind of continuum of approaches to privacy and we're making the longer term solutions gradually more practical.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to go to you, Marco, next. So IBM is really operating chiefly in the world of permissions blockchains, and clearly, if we think back to Bryan's slide, where I think he showed 4 major shortcomings of public blockchains and only 1 shortcoming of permission blockchains. But
with which I don't agree, by the way.
Okay, well, good, because
there are others that he didn't mention.
That's good, because I'm going to ask you. So, firstly, Bryan highlighted the challenge of security with permission blockchains. How does IBM overcome that challenge? And then, secondly, in my experience of working with permission blockchains, normally you have to form big consortia with loads and loads of industry players, and those are typically very, very slow to deliver value. So, they're my 2 questions. How do you get large consortia to deliver value quickly? And secondly, how do you overcome Bryan's perceived weakness of security with permission blockchains?
Okay, second question first, because it's much easier despite being actually technically difficult. Because what's technically possible, then we can basically invest research, and actually this is progressing very well. So we have a same, the origin of permission blockchains is that not the whole world sees what's going on, and not the whole world can access the data. But then after you restrict to a certain set of players, then you have another again, the same set of concerns, because among this set of players, you don't want to share all the data, you want privacy, like you want only things to be seen on a need-to-know basis, etc. So what technologies that we are looking into are, again, zero-knowledge proofs. We have, for example, in Hyperledger Fabric, there is a way that you, again, store only commitments on the blockchain, but data elsewhere. But this is now inside the protocol. It's called like private data collections, where you actually store the data only on a subset of nodes, but like what's shared across the blockchain is actually the hash that's replicated across all. So you come into all, again, each and every one of these issues, like is it encryption, is it zero knowledge, is it the solution that I mentioned, is coming again. How do we get big consortia to cooperate? I mean, this is actually the issue that I wanted to mention in context of trade lands. And it's actually the governance of permission blockchains. There's a big, what we did in Hyperledger Fabric is completely orthogonal. So you can support different governance models. There is nothing prescribed, like how would you do it. How would you do it in practice? I guess the answer is more in the audience, because like these are people that work in the different industries, that know their peers from different companies, and that can see the value that are joined, like a common database which nobody controls and which has, like, let's assume, perfect privacy and perfect scalability, can bring to their businesses. I'm not in a position to discuss this. I know it's difficult. I know it's just difficult to bring the players together, but we've seen, for example, in the reinsurance industry, we saw the will of people to come to, like different companies to come together, actually create the solutions. This is one of the obstacles, like one of the big obstacles, but there is progress. I'm pretty sure that we will see more progress. But how the governance looks like, how the incentives for these companies look like, I guess it's also case by case analysis, but it's also a difficult question, like for each case. So I don't have the answer yet.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, Charlotte, good question for you. So when I listened to your presentation, I think at the heart of it is opportunity cost, right? Because what you're doing is I mean, you're addressing problems that are urgent, where lives are at stake, and it seems to me that the technology, there is a need for you to adopt technology to be able to deliver faster, more efficiently, but the technologies clearly have massive opportunity costs where lives are at stake. So how do you make those kind of technology choices? How do you weigh up the relative merits of blockchain versus cloud versus Internet of Things and all these emerging technologies in your world with all those parameters?
Yeah, I think the ICSE is in a fortunate position that it's quite a well-known organization with a humanitarian mandate which is well supported. So there are a lot of people that come to us and say, here, look at this technology, we can work with you, we can engage with you. So we have an opportunity to see some of these technologies that are coming out that are really emergent. We also, I think what is important for the ICSE, and certainly the approach that we have taken, is to know exactly what we want when we engage with these companies, so that we're not dragged down a route to, because it looks accessible, but actually it doesn't really suit the humanitarian purposes or challenges that we have. So I think that has been a critical factor. Get our own strategy clear in terms of what it is we're trying to do, and then work out what the appropriate technological response to that. At the same time, it is to invest heavily in data protection, to understand the privacy challenges. We are fortunate that because we have privileges and immunities in our mandate, we are not actually GDPR compliant. We don't have to comply to GDPR. And we also negotiated for a humanitarian derogation for transfers of data across borders because of the sorts of work that need to be done by the ICSE. However, the principles which are behind this are about protecting lives and protecting people's identities and people's privacy, and those are critical aspects. So we have a 7-person data protection team, even though we don't have to be compliant with data protection. We have rules on data protection that we're rolling out across the organization to look at what are the challenges, particularly for individuals that are making consent to engage with organizations or to use technology that we are maybe the response that we're providing through technology that they won't necessarily understand. And so they can't really give full consent. They can't have control over what those technologies are. And then they probably have no control to remove what is happening. So we have to do that due diligence beforehand and say that if we are asking people to engage with the ICSE for a response or for us to engage with us, that technology, we've done the due diligence behind it first so that we're not imperiling the lives of people. And that is part of the critical choice that we have to make and say, is that a trusted technology? Are there aspects where the technology is useful but it's not trusted? So can we engage to work to do more privacy enhancing aspects to those technologies and then make choices about can we scale them?
Do you think, given the size of the Red Cross, that other organisations look to you as the standard setter in these kinds of areas?
ICSE is quite a conservative organization.
Okay.
That would probably, like the answer, we would say no. But if I look at the donor community or some of the sector are saying to us, like on the data protection field, you have done. I think we probably have one of the biggest data, if not the biggest data protection teams there, are saying, well, you are, and we are. They are expecting us to lead. So this series on data protection and privacy that we developed had many of the humanitarian actors across the sector involved. It was launched at the International Data Commissioners Conference around the world. So I think we have a convening power which does enable a lot of people to engage with us, which then helps to say, the ICC probably has the most extreme use cases too. So we are dealing in conflicts, highly complex environments with highly sensitive data on individuals where lives are at stake. So I think the stakes are very high. So the assumption is that the ICSE will have done that due diligence, and therefore people look to us to do that. And they ask us, do you think this is the right use? Not across the board and not in all areas, but I think certainly and increasingly so as the digital transformation and new technologies are sort of pushing us all to look at what do we want to engage with.
Okay, Gianfranco, the next question is for you. So I was going to ask you a question because I think there's a massive opportunity to take goods that platform companies, that are public goods, public data goods, and that have been made private by platforms, you know, like Uber's driver ratings, things like that, things that should be portable across platforms. So I was going to ask you a question about that, but in fact I'm not, because like Temenos works mainly with banks, and we see how difficult it is for banks to implement new technologies because of organizational resistance. And my assumption is the organizational resistance is probably even higher within government. So my question is actually going to be, let's say your proof of concepts, the use cases you're working on are successful. How big a challenge is it going to be to actually deploy these across the state of Geneva and all the thousands of people who work in those areas?
It will be very big as a challenge because as you saw, there are different layers, different type of regulations, processes, and so forth. So all that is to be discussed, agreed upon, and also from a human resources management standpoint, things have to be changed. So change management would be the biggest issue. We are not in the technology, we're really in trying to devise a better way of doing things. And the state tends to be fairly conservative as far as changing the way it actually does the procedure, processes, and so forth. I think it will be a big issue, but at the same time, if the service is improved, I think just the civil society, the businesses, etc., will add some pressure for the state to change and maybe increase the pace at which we can do that.
So you think the answer lies in getting the public on side and acting as...
Right.
Yeah, okay. Okay, Adrian, last, because I think this is, for anybody who holds cryptocurrencies, I think this is maybe the most interesting question, which is, so you're solving this problem of safe storage of digital assets. Is that the key to the rebound in the price of Bitcoin and Ethereum? Or do we need more mainstream usage of the tokens for raising equity or for digitizing existing assets? what will lead to the recovery in
You're trying to get some insider information from me, I can see. No, so I've tried, every time I've bought cryptocurrencies or invested in these sort of assets, the day after it fell 20%. So I'm not the right person to ask this sort of question. I'm a very bad predictor. Actually, I'm a very good predictor if you short my.
I was only kind of half joking. So do you think that if banks offer this safe custody, we'll get much more mainstream adoption of cryptocurrencies as an asset class?
Yeah, today there is a very strong barrier to entry to cryptocurrencies. This barrier to entry is both in terms of accessing liquidity, being able to buy crypto assets, and then to store them. I think the first part is getting solved slowly but surely. We start seeing more and more brokers allowing you to get easy access to cryptocurrencies, and it's starting to get integrated into banking traditional platforms like yours, such that as an investor, I can just log in on my e-banking platform and buy these sort of assets. Now, the second part, the storage, today has prevented many investors to get in. Think about institutional investors. Think about high net worth individuals that want to get these assets. They don't want to invest dozens of millions and then know that there is a chance that the assets manager at the private bank could potentially make a mistake and lose the key or have the key stolen. So having this sort of corporate-grade solutions is absolutely essential to have a mainstreamization of these environments. And therefore, of course, as a consequence, what we can expect is that the price is going to go up by a simple law of offer and demand. That most cryptocurrencies are deflationary or, let's say, less and less inflationary with time. It's not the case with all of them, but it's the case with Bitcoin, for instance. So if you increase the demand, which we can expect to happen in the future with this easy access to the markets, for sure I expect the market price to go up. Now, I must also say that if we look at the price of cryptocurrencies in the past, it's hard to correlate this with progress in the integration of cryptos in the market. Generally, it's a sort of a boom and crash cycle where the media starts speaking about it. There is some frenzy about it. The price goes up. Everybody follows the trend, which increases the price growth up to the point where it's become so unsustainable that there is a correction. So I would expect that in the long term, there is high chances that these asset classes go up. And I'm not speaking about only Bitcoin here, but having easier access and storage is going to be a very strong point for more people to diversify their portfolios and invest in these assets. But whether it's going to be on the short term, whether it's predictable, I don't think so.
Great. Okay, so we're going to move into the section now with general questions. So I'm going to invite everybody to comment on the on these questions, and pretty soon we'll open up to you guys. So if you have questions, please let these guys know, and they can bring you a mic. So just the first one. So there's one in the front. So I'll just ask one, and then we'll move on to your questions. So Gianfranco, I think it was in your slides where you showed the classic Gartner hype cycle, and I think you showed blockchain as having passed the peak of inflated expectations, heading quickly down towards the trough of disillusionment, and that's certainly what it feels like, right? Because news flows turn quite negative about blockchain. You can see it in the price of cryptocurrencies. But my question is, what if that consensus is wrong? I.e., what if actually it will never achieve the plateau of productivity, it will never move into mainstream usage? For example, 10 years after the advent of the internet, nobody was still talking about use cases for the internet. So are we sure that this is going to go through the classic hype cycle and there will be a phase where we are using blockchain for real use cases in everyday life? So invite any of you to answer that in any order. So, you want to go first? Go on, Rob.
Sure. Well, I'm pretty certain that, so yeah, we will see a crash. We probably already are seeing a crash. But at the same time, there is a real strong core of value in, that whole area of technology. It's already getting adopted in ways that will persist, regardless of, what happens to the price of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies, or what happens to, kind of the hype around the blockchain market. There's already real value that's materializing and tremendous impact on the way a lot of industry, as well as, technology companies are building systems. That it's a given that some of that value will survive and come back. I can't predict how much or what kinds in particular, but there's real value there.
Gianfranco? You ran out of loop.
Right. I think this is a good sign, actually, that we see that's past the peak of the expectations, because that means that some people are trying to do stuff, and they are hitting some real issues. There is a very good side effect also of the blockchain, is that people are reconsidering the business models and the way they do the process. And just for that reason, I think it will be something that will be sustained in the long run. Of course, the technology has to evolve. I mean, we have the environmental issues and all that, lack of performance and so forth. But these things are, I think, workable. There's a lot of research going on, and we are very hopeful that you'll come up with a very workable solution. But conceptually, I think this is a step that cannot be reversed. I mean, we have to find a way to make unique things in the digital world, and that's a key point. So in some way, this will survive, I think.
Not being a specialist on this, but what I would say is that organizations are looking for trusted solutions, and so there has to be continued investment in there. I think, yes, I see in the humanitarian sector that, yes, blockchain will be increasingly used. I think it will not necessarily be used in the cases that are already being explored, but I think the sorts of things that if you can have something which would be trusted communications between parties that don't trust each other, which is the sort of use case I was talking about, then that may be already something which could have a real impact. And so I think, yes, I don't think in the next couple of years, but I do think, 5, 6 years, which is actually tomorrow. And I think that, one of the things I've learned in this job over the last thing is we overestimate what we can do in 2 years, and we underestimate what we can do in 10. And I think if we don't have a vision about where we can be, then we don't actually build towards that vision. We just build on legacy. And I think these disruptive technologies are forcing us to look at how to move away from some of the legacy challenges we have and actually look at some of more visionary approaches which might resolve problems and challenges.
Just to slightly vary the question for you two, when we saw massive adoption of the internet, it was because people stopped trying to just take what existed in the analog world and put it onto the internet, and instead they started using the unique properties of the internet to do things that were different. Is that what the step that we need to take with blockchain? Is it not kind of putting on blockchain existing use cases, but coming up with the use cases that use the unique properties of blockchain?
I firmly believe that the majority of use cases will be new use cases and not porting existing things to. But like foreseeing them is difficult. But for example, when I discussed the sovereign network, that there was like the ideas that lurk around that you create another, like completely new business model that are related to certifying other people's information, right? I do believe in this. So I also, to come back to original question, like 5 to 10 years from now, are we in the state of affairs where like as if nothing ever happened? Like for sure not, for sure not. What I see as maybe a hurdle for adoption is if governments would now start saying like really regulating them strictly or like banning the technology, especially permissionless like open blockchains, right? Which I doubt it will happen with 2 permission blockchains. Permission blockchains have another hurdle to like which we discussed, which is about creating consortia, etc. Yeah. So there, but for example, in open permissionless network, there is no way like this disappears, right? Maybe it stays like if everybody regulates against them, maybe it stays on the like to deal stuff on black market, but it will for sure stay there.
Okay. Adrian, and then I think we have a question from the third row. So, Adrian, do you want to just comment quickly?
Yeah, just a quick comment about it. I agree with you that it's very important to have new use cases, but if you look in the last 2 years, what has been the use case of blockchain has been ICOs. What is an ICO? It's some crowdfunding pushed, to the alphabet, you really pushed to the maximum, where you don't really care who is investing, you don't really care from what country, you don't really care whether it's 1 million or whether it's 1,000, you take any money that's on the market. And it's a complete revolution. Of course, it's going to be, now there's going to be frictions due to regulations, and that's traditionally we're used to it, but this is a use case that we didn't know exactly per se in the traditional world because it was physically impossible to raise money from anywhere in the world due to all the frictions of the banking system, all the costs, etc. Now there is a system where you can raise money everywhere from the world. It's very fast, it's very efficient, and it works. Companies have been able to raise much more, and or again, maybe it's not a really good thing because it has created bubble. It has created companies that have hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cryptocurrencies but don't really have a business plan. But still, it is something new that is prone to remain in the future. Now, last comment about it, just getting back to this idea that blockchain is great and cryptocurrencies are going to disappear, which many people now in the market and in banking agree with. I think this is wrong to think so. I think if you look at how much cryptocurrency is already used and useful for countries that are unbanked or the countries that have an unstable currency or national currency, which for instance is hyperinflating, Bitcoin is already a very good hedge. And there are other cryptocurrencies that would provide this way to easily store wealth and store purchasing power and transfer money in a way that many people don't have access to currently in their countries. Think about Venezuela, think about Argentina, Zimbabwe, many countries that are in a very bad situation. So I think that having this hedge to national currencies doesn't mean it's going to replace them, but it means that it pushes national central banks to become more competitive, improve their own systems, and in the end, we just have to choose whichever is the best approach.
Great, thank you very much. So there's a question here, third row.
My name is Philippe Thévaux from the company SIGPA. My daily job at SIGPA is to enable trust in the digital world, not only for banknotes, but in the digital world. And of course, blockchain is a way to enable trust. And the time-stamping of a data on the blockchain is, of course, fundamental to prove that this data is genuine and has been time-stamped at a given time. But it's not because a data is on a blockchain or is secure by a blockchain that it has a value. It will have a value if you can trust who has issued this data. And typically on the sovereign network, if I make a claim that I'm Philippe, and I ask the authority to back up this claim, if this is coming from the authority of Lausanne, you will probably trust it. But if I do this claim, I'm from any country or somewhere in the world, how can you trust that this is really an authority who is behind this stamp on the blockchain? So this is a very important point, to have a trust identity of behind a data. And the second thing is not only to have data integrity, but also process integrity. How can I make sure that this data has been processed in the right way according to an authorized and authenticated process? I could predict the result of a football game of tonight now for sure and win and show you that my prediction tomorrow is the result of the game. How could I do that? I just put on the blockchain 100 guesses, 00, 10, 01, etc. These are all hashes on the blockchain. And tomorrow I just take the right result and I show you that I timestamped that on the blockchain before the game. But I corrupted the process. So process integrity is also a very important point in addition to blockchain. Thank you.
Okay, so so how can we ensure trust and adherence to proper process without any central intermediaries? Bryan, you kick us off.
Sure. Well, that's hard. Really. So, in fact, that's and I think some of the stories that Adrian mentioned about really illustrate one of the key problems, even with a highly secure blockchain that's working pretty well and doing a really good job of maintaining the integrity of whatever you put on it. It can't ensure that the right thing has gone on it, and it can't ensure that transactions you ask it for, or that say a payment that it's that you put on it is actually legitimate if somebody's stolen the private keys, for example, right? Or if somebody's stolen the private keys of whoever is supposed to sign the identity record and say that this is really this person, right? So getting data, the right data securely on a blockchain is still still often, at least at this point, necessarily entrusted to some private party. So you still have to have, have trust in the private parties and the processes by which often physical real world processes in which the data that goes onto the blockchain is validated, or the requests made, say, to a to a bank or repository. I want to make this payment or use this this transaction in this way. You're going to have to trust an off-blockchain party for a lot of these kinds of things. The same thing came up with the smart contract case. You can create a smart contract on the blockchain, code on the blockchain that automatically decides, like, AXA did this really nice, insurance experiment, automatically paying insurance policy. If your flight is late, it'll automatically pay you, in Ethereum or whatever. But how do they know if the flight is late? Well, the only way a blockchain can know is if a, typically centralized party called an oracle says, puts the information and says, okay, this other trusted party says that that flight was late or was not late, and you're down again to trusting a party, going on or off the blockchain. The on and on off ramps are where all the accidents happen in blockchain land in many cases. And, that's going to be an ongoing problem. There's, ways we're moving that forward, but there's no perfect solution.
Adrian, do you want to come on that? Because I've read pieces by you where you've talked about the interplay between permissions and public blockchains. Could that be the answer here, where we?
By construction, the blockchain is supposed to be immutable and to only go one way, which is going in the future. Yeah. In theory, you can't go to the past. And now it's almost true with public distributed ledgers like Ethereum or Bitcoin. It's a bit less true with less distributed system or consortium ledgers, where you always have this very bad option to go back in the past if something terrible happens. So I would say that this is, in general, a big problem. I fully agree with Bryan that today it's not really how the blockchain processes information that is the biggest issue. It's how you interact from the outside with the blockchain and prove who you are and what you want to put in, which is the difficult part. This example, I like very much your example with you want to import information. I like to give an example where you want to have a smart contract regulating gambling, for instance, and it pays automatically depending on the soccer team that won the competition. It's very good and it works, but who is actually telling the smart contract who won? Smart contract is not an intelligent machine, it's just a piece of software which needs to be connected to some external feed. And this is where you generally get back to something much more centralized. And therefore for those applications, you tend to ask yourself whether you really need to have such distribution. Maybe a lower level of distribution is sufficient, because in the end, the weakest point is always who interacts, and this is generally something much more centralized.
Gianfranco, could this be the role of the government in this decentralized world, which is, I think you even used the term oracle in your presentation, where it's acting as the referee and it's creating the inputs where needed into these various chains?
Today we already have this role in the government. I mean, we entrust the government with our data, and it's no different with the blockchain. Basically, the government could issue some records that are reliable based on the fact that we trust the government on the practices that they already in place. So from the perspective of the public records that are managed by the government, I think the system is already working. I mean, we can issue some statements that are government-backed, that people can use and further verify and automate through smart contracts and so forth. But the origin of the information really controlled, and it's also regulated by law. And we already have trust in that system. So from a public standpoint, I think public administration standpoint, we don't really have that issue. We just continue functioning as we do. We use the blockchain mainly to facilitate the usage of the information by third parties. But the origin, at least for now, seems to be to keep centralize it and under the control of the public authorities.
Okay, great. I should have said thank you, sir, for your question. Is there another? There's a question over there. Okay.
Yes, my name is Robin Cornelius. I'm in a company called Product DNA, and we are tracing, organizing traceability for supply chains in different sectors for the last 15 years. My question is, when I listened to our SIGPA colleague, he came to trust. How can we trust? And I come back for today when we say in the real world, I'm happy we go to that point of trust, because finance, crypto money is part. It's just the oil of the economy, the money, but it's not what's interesting me. Is, if you take, it's more for Bryan, that one. If you consider that trust is the accelerator, trust among supply chain stakeholders, right? Trust is an accelerator of business. Smart contract and facilitator, think blockchain, right? If you consider trust will be enhanced if you have a non-invasive control system, like blockchain, because what you put on blockchain, you can't remove it, right? How important would it be in terms of trust and accelerating the business, and how efficient is it that to avoid, Mr. Sigma, what he said, particularly in textile, fake certificates, fake audits. Imagine my boss tells me, Robin, you have to put on, find me a certificate GOTS, it's a certificate for organic cotton, right? Find me one, we need one. I say, no, sir, because I will be traced. I will not dare to put fake information. So I think that infant, you said, Bryan, and I'm finished with that. Blockchain is something infant technology, but trust is for years. And I do believe that trust is a unique way, I mean, not for very confidential aspect, more for brick and mortar, metrics, volumes. I put online, I bought 400 tons, and I thread it, and I sell 500 out of it. It doesn't work. But how important is the trust? How can we be enhanced thanks to this blockchain technology? Does it make sense? We have been tracing hundreds and hundreds or more than that to introduce a blockchain in our procedures to accompany all the information between stakeholders. You followed, Bryan? It's okay?
I think more or less. Let me see if I can. Okay. I think you touched on some very important points there, like especially in the supply chain applications of blockchain, like you're talking about. So a lot of the, you know, a blockchain can't magically create trust. Trust has to somehow be there, and in supply chain applications, you have to have parties along the supply chain, you know, scanning goods and putting information in the blockchain about, you know, what product was, you know, created or scanned or evaluated or whatnot. And at all of those stages, individually, you have to trust not just the blockchain to, you know, record the information, but you have to trust the parties and devices and individuals that are putting data on the blockchain. Again, the on-ramps and off-ramps problem, you know, blockchain never solves that. But, you know, a very important, you know, maybe this is what you were referring to as the trust acceleration aspect. A very important aspect is even if we don't trust any of those, or can't or don't want to trust any of those points individually, what I think the essence of how the blockchain can improve trust in this situation is by making all of those records together comparable and accountable, and it really gets back to trust but verify. You know, you trust these points along the way, but you have a better basis of verifying. If somebody does decide to you know, try to forge a document or put the wrong thing, or, you know, pretend this shipment went there when it went there, you know, inconsistencies will appear publicly that people can, you know, alarm bells will go off, people can start calling each other, figuring out what went wrong, who to blame, what recourse is needed legally, financially, whatever, right? So the transparency aspect, you know, of the technology, even just, you know, doing that, even though it doesn't replace the need to trust all of those individuals and all the, you know, individual private parties, but it can bring them together in a way that can allow us to verify, trust but verify, and verify all of those points against each other, and that is extremely powerful. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but does it come close? Okay.
Okay. Satisfied customer. Okay, so we started late, so I think we've probably got time for maybe one or two more questions. There's a hand up there. I can't see if it's...
Good evening. Excuse me. My name is David Jensen. I work for the UN Environment Program. I had two questions. The first is we deal with big data sets, global planetary data sets that are aggregations of multiple inputs from member states, 193 of them. So I'm wondering if Bryan could speak to how blockchain can support the management of big global planetary data sets. And then the second question I think was for Marco. There was a slide at the end that talked about open governance of the blockchain or of your partnership. Can you explain a little bit more about what open governance means and what the UN could potentially learn about from open governance in your experience? Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. So on the first question, I think. I think there is real potential for blockchain to be a part of managing the use of data sets. I don't think practically any of the current blockchains that are out there are really ready for this. So big data sets collected in one place, especially if they're privacy sensitive at all, are a huge target for attack. And current blockchains can generally, if you've collected a big data set and even you've encrypted everything perfectly, it's on a big cloud system or a big, private set of servers, you've encrypted it properly, but somebody's got to store the keys somewhere, the private keys, and that's where typically things still go wrong. The blockchain, at least current blockchains, can't manage the keys and ensure that, the keys can't get lost or misused. And if the keys, something happens wrong to those encryption keys, an attacker can still, use those leaked keys to, exfiltrate, do bad things with the whole data set at once. So, blockchain is absolutely not a panacea solution to, data access management. On the other hand, we are making steps forward, I think, toward being able to, in some sense, entrust the keys to the blockchain as well as the data in a sufficiently secure and private fashion to, make steps forward. On the other hand, for really sensitive data sets, I wouldn't even want, I think we need to be looking forward to these technologies that allow us to do the processing we need of those data sets using privacy-preserving techniques. So we do the processing we need under encryption or in a split trust model so that nobody ever needs to see the data sets or, in whole or get access. We never should have to trust any single private party for the whole data set. Currently, like I said, that's extremely expensive, but we're getting closer to being able to do that.
Marco, would you address the question on open governance?
Yeah. So I'm not sure what open governance was related to, whether the Hyperledger project or instantiations of blockchain networks. Hyperledger. Yeah. So Hyperledger. Hyperledger is an open source project that has its own governance bodies. It's mostly, it's not really original. I mean, there are premier members that actually can have more like voting power on the Hyperledger governance board. So it's more like the openness is really in the code bases and in the governance, like whole governance process that I'm not that familiar with, I would say. On a related matter, I would say that, I just thought about how to answer a different question, like how governance of blockchain is related to UN. So it occurred to me that UN is a good example, like after all these centuries of wars, and it's actually like brought together to, in the first place, to prevent wars, right? Future wars, and in the sense we have a consortium of countries. Like there we have a bit of weighted voting in the Security Council because some countries vote like count a bit more than others. And I would say that the relation is like, I currently don't like blockchain governance, neither the open permissionless blockchains where you actually have the power of the developers, not so much the miners, but the power of developers, which are like not defined, right? We had an example of like how permission blockchains are easier to roll back, and we had actually examples of permissionless blockchains rolling back because of lack of strict governance, because one person in the case of DAO attack decided that actually it should go that way and not this way. So I think blockchains have a lot of ground to cover on governance itself. I still don't think it's time for UN to learn from blockchains, but more probably the other way around.
Okay, final question, I think, given the time constraints. Oh, there are a few. So if you're not able to ask a question, I think everybody's sticking around for the drinks, so you'll be able to ask them, I think, in the networking time. We'll go with this one at the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Ludwig. I created a startup called Como Chain. We accelerate the transactions for commodity trading world. And my question is, we have a technical solution. We might be able to manage the change management. And the question is on the legal side. How long do you think it will be legally binding to use a smart contract for B2B or also at the government level? Thank you very much.
I'm very, very, very pleased that we had a question about smart contracts because, so in addition to that question about the longevity of smart contracts, the other thing that would be good to hear from you guys on is how we marry the vagaries of contractual law with immutable code. So if you could address kind of both of those questions, that would be great. Maybe we'll start with you, Adrian, because you're already mic'd up.
So, well, thank you. Thank you. I'm not so much the expert of the legal aspects. One thing I can quickly mention, it's not answering directly your question, but it's still related to some specific smart contracts out there. I was mentioning ICOs, but what we start observing now is not ICOs for new tokens, but it's the securitization or the tokenization of assets, of securities. And this is generally done through a smart contract. And there are now multiple legal bodies studying this concept and trying to make it a legal process to issue shares on the blockchain through a smart contract. And I would not be able to give you all of the details, but it seems pretty clear today that it is possible to do so, it is legal to do so, and having a token on the blockchain is actually binding as being a share of a company, for instance. And this could be applied to real estate assets, to Picasso painting, or to any sort of security. So whether it applies to any smart contracts, I'm not sure, and I don't think so at the time, but at least for this specific use case, it is the case.
Anybody else want to talk about the intersection of contract law and...
I want to hear you talk about when smart contracts are going to be legally binding in Geneva, or what this...
Well, just for starters, I don't think smart contracts is actually contracts. Smart contracts are probably just the execution part of the contract. There is an entire context that cannot be translated into instructions as a smart contract code. And plus, I mean, if there is arbitration, the contract is to be read by an authority. And therefore, you cannot just translate all of that into code. I don't think the smart contract will ever become legal from that standpoint.
Does it, so the question was about longevity. I think the other side of it is how complex contractual affairs or transactions can we put on blockchain?
Yeah, and I fully second what you just said. I think a real world contract is always a bigger thing than just a piece of code that's that is supposed to approximate it or represent maybe the common case processes around it. So I think I see smart contracts as they become more real and closer to real contracts. They'll become an optimization for the common case of processing contracts where everything goes fine the way everybody expects, and for all sorts of reasons, especially their complexity, especially that there might be a bug in the contract, contract code, or maybe the contract code is perfectly and verified, but it's discovered that it didn't really reflect the intent of the people, and I'm not a lawyer, but lawyers care about intent as well as, what the precise wording says. And, you know, so for smart contracts to become real, there's going to have to be, you know, processes around, you know, recourse and, you know, something goes wrong or merely unexpectedly, you know, how do you go back and fix it? And, you know, what's the fallback path? And the governance, you know, the governance in smart contracts, you know, systems is an enormous unsolved problem, which, you know, I also second what Marco said about, you know, blockchain communities and smart contract systems need to learn about and adopt the, you know, the physical world processes that the deliberative, you know, institutions have been building for centuries. You know.
Okay, so I think we'll probably have to leave it there, sadly. I think with like every blockchain panel in the world ever, we've run out of time because it's a complex area, it's a nascent area, and there's still so much to learn. But I think we've been very lucky, very privileged to have 5 such eminent speakers with us talking about blockchain this evening. So I'd like to thank them for their time and their participation. I'd also like to thank you for coming along and for the questions that you have asked. So thank you very much, and please, if you can, stick around for the cocktail drinks because we will all stick around and we'll all be available for questions. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Just wanted to